Lines are a fundamental component of composition, even though they are not always consciously visible, hence why it's important to first spot them. Since the images we deal with on a daily basis are rendered, there is actually no hard edges that will define perfectly straight lines. Still, it's rare that an image has no structural lines. One of the reasons being that, as we saw with the Gestalt principles, we tend to recreate lines even out of simple dashed lines, and to even extend lines beyond their ending points. So we already are creating dynamics lines in our brain. Generally speaking, lines will emerge from contrast within our image, if there's a change of orientation, a shadow, a change of materiality. What is important to understand is that contrary to shape, lines can be experienced in different ways depending on their orientation. And hey, why make things easy when they can be complicated, right? Orthogonal lines will generally be more experienced as boundaries, meaning they will symbolize a frontier between one area and another. As I mentioned earlier, it can be the change between one material and another, or simply between an area in the sun and an area in the shade, or the limit of your building. Even though those lines are not technically directionless, they are considered to be resting when it comes to tension. Whether they are vertical or horizontal, they don't create much tension in an image. They just organize the space. Tensions can arise when you start moving them closer to the boundary of your frame. For instance, a horizontal line could be your horizon, and having it standing very low or high in your frame would create tension. Hence why generally people advise to put the horizon on a third, whether upper or lower. I personally don't suggest this simple trick because I think it takes away part of what is interesting about dealing with tension and finding the actual right answer for your image, which is generally not a perfect third, but something in between. Since lines generally symbolize the frontier between two zones, the weight of this frontier will depend on the contrast between the two zones. If they are of almost similar qualities, then the line will be very faint, but if there's a stark contrast between the two zones, say a dark matte plaster next to a very reflective white tiles, then this line will be much more emphasized. So what matters for orthogonal line is generally not the line itself, but what is on either side of it and where it is placed in the canvas.
No, diagonals or obliques are fun little guys. We'll see them more in depth in the dynamic symmetry chapter in Diamond 4 about framing, but we can already cover them on a weight and tension point of view. Unlike orthogonal lines, diagonals can also, on top of differentiating zones, act as vectors and convey directions. This is particularly interesting because what it does is not to have weight, but to add weight on where it's directed. Now, we've seen earlier in the part about anisotropy that diagonals are read from left to right, so they will never point backward, at least not intuitively. So weight will generally be added to the object or general zones that is at the end or on the right side of the diagonal. There's plenty of examples in real life, the simplest one being someone literally pointing somewhere. You generally don't look at their arm or finger, you look at what they are pointing at. Another one would be a road that leads to a specific element, etc. Of course, the more the line is legible, due to its contrast, the more weight it will create and redirect to the object it leads to. And as usual, all the tension regarding placement still applies. Now, last but not least, curves, or what we sometimes call arabesque, which is a cute name for an S-curve. Curves are kind of a mix of the ones mentioned earlier. They can act as boundaries, they can act as vectors. The main difference is that their organic shape gives them a specific weight in an image. First, curves, or more generally organic shape, tend to be more appealing because they are easy and pleasing to follow, less strict than a straight line. But also curves can be valuable because they create contrast with straight lines, so that when you have both in your image, the contrast between straight and curved lines will create tension that you can play around with. Overall, lines are generally a consequence of how you organize your elements in the scene, but their power as vectors and boundary symbolizers must be taken into account and accurately integrated into your choice of composition. If your lines are all over the place and leading the eye to random places, this can create unnecessary frustration for the viewer that might not spend the time your image could deserve. As usual, keeping things simple and organized can help in keeping your composition legible. Having a couple of strong lines will generally work better than having 15 lines pointing in different directions. I mentioned it here, but I will mention it again many times in other chapters. The weight of the line is in part proportional to the contrast between what is on one side and what is on the other. So if you have physical lines that you can't move because of, say, an existing building or a curb that is in the frame, remember that you can play around with light, color, texture, etc. in order to decrease the contrast between the two sides of that line so that the line becomes less visible. And you can of course use the same logic in order to emphasize the structural lines that you've chosen for your composition. So yep, that'll be it for lines in general.